Hello again, this is the Unretired Engineer coming to you to talk about science fiction and engineering. Today it's science fiction. So for a long time, Star Wars and Star Trek have frustrated me in that they essentially use space battles as a background trope, and the way that they do it and the way that they display it and also how it interacts with the story is very unbelievable once you have any real thinking about what it means to fight in space, to operate in space, etc. And it's really makes it very hard to suspend your disbelief and just live with the story. Star Wars is very much World War II fighter technology with the fighters operating almost as if they're in air and operating at point blank range with weapons which theoretically should be extremely accurate and hard hitting at short range. They have laser pom-poms, and then also the ships dodge around almost as if they're fighters themselves. They're not quite as maneuverable, but still you have these hundreds of thousands of tons of vessel just kind of maneuvering at close range, ponderously but quickly, and none of it really makes any sense. Star Trek and other movies kind of operate more on an age of sail. They have broadsides firing. It's a broadside to broadside, and the shields as armor, and phasers as big guns. Everything is done again at point blank, and it's just okay. This is not how it would be done if you were in a real fight. And the other is that essentially all of this is done as a background, as like a theater backdrop to what's going on with the people, which is okay, that's fine. But the problem is it's treated that way, and it's basically throwaway. It's not treated as a coherent set, and everything is basically, well, the writer just wrote it that way. It's not because that's the way the system, the physics, the technology that they posit, not because all of that interacts in a certain way, and this is what would happen because of that. But I mean, essentially, what they want you to do is switch your brain off and enjoy the characters. And a lot of people, they don't know that this is not the way it would be, so it has no effect. For an engineer, I kind of look at it and it breaks my mind a bit. But my thesis when I'm writing is that, technology creates a terrain, right? And that the terrain creates tactics, and then people interact with those things to create depth and character reveals that really are, I think, much more rich when you're writing. So in the age of sail, if you go back, there were broadside to broadside. Why was that? It was because they couldn't reliably hit anything at more than a few hundred feet. And you still needed to get to a decision point before the ship caught fire or something disastrous happened. So what happened is they put the most number of guns they could. They got as close, and they brought the battle to conclusion as quickly as they could. So the technology of sail, the technology of the cannons, the technology of aiming, all of that interacted to create a terrain on the sea, right? And the sea wouldn't matter all that much, but other than that they were sailing around and found each other and went to fight. But by the time you got to the big gun era of Bismarck and Hood and the Iowa battleships, all that, you fought at the horizon, right? You essentially were as far away from the other guy as you could be, because if you were at point blank range, you would hit every time. every broadside would essentially blow the enemy ship, and they would blow you out of the water every time. It would all be over. So you didn't fight at that range. You fought upwards of 20 miles, right? And at 20 miles, you could hit occasionally. We didn't hit every time, but you would hit. And the ships were designed to fight at that range. They had protection optimized for that range, and systems optimized for that range. So the same ocean, right, had created a very different tactical picture because the terrain had been changed by the technology. So when you're talking about science fiction, it's the same thing. You do have you have space, right? You can see at huge ranges, and everybody is basically maneuvering in the same space. But so performance of your propulsion system, the performance of your weapon systems, and your sensing systems all matter. They all create a terrain over which you have to develop your tactics, and then the tactics then reveal the character and move the story forward. It's a much more rich synthesis. So there are video programs and novels that get this right? So on the video, The Expanse is one where, they famously are pretty accurate. Acceleration and delta V and all of those things matter. Detection range matters. Weapons matter. So it's a very rich terrain over which the characters have to develop the tactics and what they're going to do. This is a very, it's one of the reasons that program has a very strong following. The Lost Fleet is a series of novels that also gets it right. They're very different, right? So in that world, ships can accelerate at very high rates, but they can see each other at very long distances. And, their weapons are extremely lethal. You can't, again, it's a little bit like the big battleships. You have to get within range, but you want to stay at that range very short. So your formation matters, your tactics matter a lot. You maneuver, you basically accelerate to contact. Contact happens in a fraction of a second, and it's all automated weapons. But humans are engaged in the setting everything up ahead of time and then dealing with the aftermath. So they are very rich in the texture that they build into the stories, and over the series, you get a really strong feeling about why it was that these cultures, at least their military culture, developed the way it was. It doesn't make these stories any less exciting. And maybe you could say it's a little more grim in some ways, but in other ways it's much richer and I think much more engaging in the big picture. So we've talked a little bit about deep space and all the rest of it, and to be honest, Star Trek and Star Wars treat near Earth space and deep space very similarly. The reality is that's very different, right? It's when you're near a planet, it is very different, but the same things, the technology still has a huge effect on the terrain. The planet just makes that overall terrain much more complex. One of the things is all very obvious is a planet, when you're relatively close to it, creates a big blind spot. But it also creates a spot, if you're close enough to the planet, where your, certain arc is kind of protected, right? Because if somebody gets into that space, they're going to be very open to your attack. So they're not going to get there unless they do that intentionally. So it really controls the tactics a great deal. But on the downside, if you're close to a planet, okay, your backside's protected to some degree, but what's happening around the curve of the Earth, the limb of the planet, right, as it's called, you don't know. So you have that open area, which is, is going to be thousands and thousands of kilometers away. So you have a little, kind of buffer there, but it is an important other aspect. And then gravity well also limits you to some degree in that it's going to change the dynamics of certain weapons. It's going to change your dynamics to a limited degree. Anyway, this is, a place where, kind of the richness of your technology tactic stack kind of comes even more into play. Because here it is very much like our modern day. You don't take a cruiser into close to shore if you can avoid it. Cruisers and most big warships are optimized for fighting at long range, right? That's, they're deep space fighting each other in that space. Once they get inshore or very close in, they can be attacked much more quickly. They don't have time to react. They don't have time to put the defenses up. And so a number of small ships that are not dangerous at range suddenly become very dangerous. I mean, this is an issue that's been with us forever. It's one of the reasons that you have ships designed for fighting in the littoral versus ships fighting in the deep blue. And, here again, that's very, very true. And the tech stack kind of takes that into account. The novels that I have just put up on Kindle are a trilogy plus a short novel. The Sea of Suns is an ode of a very, very advanced technology, humans, with their star realm, which is a complex. I mean, they have starflight, they have fast and light travel, but the density of population is relatively low. A lot of systems are populated, but they're not necessarily populated all that heavily. And there is a form of central government, but that central government is relatively loose because though a starship can travel faster than light, it can only cover about a light year per day. So, most occupied systems are way more than one light year apart. So there's kind of a ongoing issue of systems wanting to pull away from the center, do their own thing, but also everybody wants to have all the trade and all the rest of that. And so, you have opportunities for piracy, for raiding, for minor wars and whatnot. And so there's a lot of texture there in the overall society built around the technology. On the combat side, the assumption is energy is basically free, that you have very compact, high power density fusion reactors at any scale. And you have a propulsion system which is gravity, a kind of form of gravitic drive which allows you to operate in an essentially inertialess frame, at least on board, allows the ship to accelerate at very high speed, but it still has to accelerate and decelerate. It's not you've done away with inertia, but the people inside don't feel it because they're accelerating in a gravity field. So, but big ships accelerate at 100 Gs, smaller vessels a couple of hundred Gs. That there is a system of light speed, jump, a skip. Essentially, you are able to insert yourself into a kind of a wave function and go in a straight line to a point where either you come out because you've entered a change in the gravity gradient near a planet, or you've timed out, you come out, you haven't experienced any time, but the rest of the universe has experienced time. For a little while, you've been a photon, right? Experience is no time, but you now come out at the other end. The world has gone on, but you've arrived at the speed of light, so with no real warning. This enables you to come into the attack and then and then if you're in trouble, to skip out of the attack. So it makes a very rich kind of tactics in for small ships and maneuvering, maneuver warfare. There is a faster than the light, as I mentioned earlier. It's operates around a light year per day, a little bit faster, a little bit slower, depending on the ship. But it breaks down once you get close to the gravity gradient of a star. So essentially, a big ship coming in from the outside can jump in at light speed, well, way more than light speed. But once within that period, once within that transit limit, has to then operate on skip. And then once they get closer to a planet, even the skip starts to not work. So they have limits of what they can do. So ships are optimized for long range fighting and not for short range fighting. There are small ships and fighter light ships which operate at the short range near planets and near that, they create a richness of tactics. The weapons, there's a transit rifle which essentially uses the same system as the faster than light to drop a shell at range faster than light. It's a little bit like dropping a depth bomb on a submarine. If it detonates close enough to the submarine is damaged. If the transit rifle round lands close enough, then the target is damaged. So again, it's kind of the equivalent of a big gun, and again, it has its own limitations, and that creates tactics and adds richness. And then shorter range, you use lasers because you're maneuvering so fast and you're so able to move around. You need a light speed weapon to be able to even engage. So you have X-ray and gamma ray lasers because again, you have to hit very hard, very quickly on very fleeting targets. And then there's a thing called a pulse rifle, which essentially fires a plasma bolt. So a little bit of matter at a very high energy state at fractional light speed. It's used for defenses against things like missiles or in the short range fight between ships and fighters. Again, adding another layer of, you get closer in, the lasers are then added to by the pulse rifle and etc. You have more weapons engaged as you get closer and closer. So from a platform level, there is the EVA suit, spacesuit, has evolved into a powered armor, right? Which is cool, and the military version of that is a Lega. A Lega is a Marine, essentially, and the Marine, he can maneuver in space. They have that capability. They have no skip. They don't have the inertialess drive, but they are able to maneuver at pretty high rates, but at short range. But their main purpose in the big battle is either as foot infantry or as the pilots of the fighters. The fighters are called pod fighters. They are essentially an energy construct, not a material construct. So they are a few picograms of very high energy matter woven together to create a structure which operates like a physical ship, accelerating, decelerating, skipping. But they're also very fragile. They're very, able to maneuver. And then the Lega basically rides them almost like a warhorse or like a World War II fighter pilot riding their aircraft, their fighter. But the thing that's really important and thing that's protected is the pilot, the Lega, not the pod fighter, which is disposable, but also dangerous in that if it destabilizes, it can explode. And again, that energy is then released in an explosion, much like a nuclear explosion. There are things called weapons mounts, which are essentially maneuverable heavy weapons like a heavy machine gun or a grenade launcher or a mortar, which are semi-defensive. They are maneuverable, but they don't maneuver that fast. And more of a backup or defensive or area control weapon, not a offensive weapon. The ring ship is the light ship, basically what you use for working inside the solar system. They're called ring ships because they're often ring shaped and use rotation for gravity instead of the artificial gravity that larger ships use. And then there's the rail and the node ship. The rail and the node are both very similar. They're gravitic systems that are they look like a linear accelerator. So a ship will look like a globe or an oval with the rail going through it, extending, many times the length of the hull. This is the propulsion system that gives them the ability to accelerate, but also gives them the transit capability. So, if you see a rail or the much bigger node ship, then you know that this is an FTL, very heavy, well armed, very high power because they have very large reactors to generate power. So they're the heavy ships in the system. Each has a role, each has its strengths, each has their limitations. Again, those limitations are wrapped up in the systems that provide them their movement, etc. So again, as I said, in this world, there's a lot of push and tug as to systems wanting to break away from the central government, but also wanting the central government there to limit piracy and raiding and whatnot. So the protagonist is in a separate group that is sent off from the main ship to go to a system which had been causing a lot of trouble, but it's also a system that really doesn't count for much, which is part of its problem. But it's a center of piracy, and it's a center of a lot of secessionist kind of political stuff. So this unit is sent there to basically show the flag, say, okay, don't do that, pay your taxes. We're here to protect you, but, also be good, good boys and girls. Unfortunately, they arrive at a time where the foment has reached the point that the local sovereign has decided that he wants to try and break away and become much more of his, control his system the way he wants to and do what he wants to do. And so leads to a battle with that small group of ships. And that's what the whole Lap Club burning is about. It is essentially that battle. It's the lead up and the post of that battle from the point of view of the main protagonist, but also of a lot of the other people. So on both sides of the fight. So you kind of get a lot of the feel of what's going on and why, etc. So it is the deepest and longest battle sequence in the trilogy, plus this short novel. There are others in there, but if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's a good standalone novel. Kind of give you an idea. Might be a good place if that's the sort of thing you like. So the information on it's in the description, and so it's on Kindle. And so if you have the Kindle system where you can get novels for free, it's there, available. So have a look. But anyway, so just to close out, even in a place where there doesn't appear to be any terrain, technology creates a terrain itself. Terrain creates tactics, right? So it's not really just weapons. It's really weapons are technology. Technology creates terrain. So, the weapons create tactics. And then tactics reveal character, right? Because they're the very personal piece of that stack. I mean, you have strategy, you have operations, you have tactics. Tactics is the very personal level, right above, terrain and technology. And that's where really a lot of the richness comes from, and the richness that I'm interested as a writer putting into my stories. you can say, okay, well, all this is fun. Thank you very much. Doesn't really mean much. But I would point out that this whole thesis is as real in the real world as it is in writing, if you like this kind of writing. And that is that location plus technology plus tactics are all inputs with very unclear outputs, right? They interact with each other in ways that are not always obvious. It's why, all battles tend to be very stochastic in their outcomes. They're not determined from the very beginning. Even when people say they are, the reality is there were things, if they went very much to plan, then that was because people were lucky, not because that was, bound to be the case. So, kind of pulling this out, the thread out is that, you ought to think of this when you're looking at the real world, is all of these things interact in a very deep way. And then people have a very large role to play in all of this. And that is where reality and fiction kind of come to the fore, because it makes for good fiction and it makes reality what it is. So the Sea of Suns trilogy and the Lap Club Burning are in the links below. Hit like and subscribe, and I will be back in a while as the unretired engineer to talk some more about engineering projects and science fiction. Cheers.